India says net zero carbon isn't the answer, and then committed to achieving it in nearly 50 years. China didn't show up.
China not showing up? Come on.
Well, China's presence is a slap in the face to the entire movement.
The young people took to the streets to protest. It's been a flurry of activity in the weeks leading up to COP26.
Is the biggest gathering of world leaders in this country since the foundation of the UN.
They write headlines that are not consistent with the science that's in the report.
We need action, and we need it right now.
But we need to hit the ground running.
This Council of the Parties over climate change is a critical one, as it marks the 5th year since the Paris Agreement at COP21. And according to that agreement, this year is a measuring stick, a report card on how the nations of the world are doing to keep emissions down.
Is this how our story is due to end? A tale of the smartest species doomed by that all too human characteristic of failing to see the bigger picture in pursuit of short-term goals.
And we don't need to scare our kids into tears, which is literally what they're doing.
The clock on the doomsday device that I talked about is still ticking, but we've got a bomb disposal team on site.
A few weeks before the start of COP26, document leaks revealed that countries like Saudi Arabia, Japan and Australia have been moving behind closed doors to play down the need to move so rapidly away from fossil fuels for energy. While some COP26 sponsors like Microsoft, NatWest and GSK have been raising complaints of poor planning, even though they had an extra year to prepare. In the meantime, about 120 world leaders braved the global pandemic to attend, including host Boris Johnson of the UK and US President Joe Biden. Notably on the decline to attend list is Xi Jinping of China and Vladimir Putin of Russia. The UN has downplayed these absences, but can real progress be made at this event? Will it be chaos or a coming together? Will it be hostility or harmony? COP26 has come to Scotland, and I've come home on this very special episode of The Road to Glasgow. Hi, I'm Shonagh Smith and very glad to be back home in Scotland. Welcome to Glasgow, home of the 26th Council of the Parties, or COP, that the United Nations holds for the climate. The road to Glasgow has been a particularly long one. The pandemic caused a year-long delay of this event. And yet, with the extra year, there have been complaints by major players at COP that the preparations are last minute and a bit chaotic. COVID has been a major factor in travel plans, logistics and protocols at the event itself. But in spite of the controversies, complaints and COVID, Alok Sharma and United Kingdom Prime Minister Boris Johnson were very optimistic.
I am cautiously optimistic in the sense that on the way to the G20 in Rome, I said to some of you on the plane that if this was a football match, then the current score would be 5-1 down in the match between humanity and climate change. And I think what you could say today, after 2 days of talks with around 120 world leaders, is that we've pulled back a goal, or perhaps even two.
I believe that we can resolve the outstanding issues. We can move the negotiations forward, and we can launch a decade of ever-increasing ambition and action. And together, we can seize the enormous opportunities for green growth, for good green jobs, for cheaper, cleaner power. But we need to hit the ground running to develop the solutions that we need. And that work, my friends, starts today.
But clearly the hit of the opening ceremonies and the talk that had everyone buzzing here at the COP was David Attenborough's dramatic speech.
It comes down to this. The people alive now or the generation to come will look at this conference and consider one thing. Did that number stop rising and start to drop as a result of commitments made here? There's every reason to believe that the answer can be yes. If working apart, we are a force powerful enough to destabilize our planet, surely working together, we are powerful enough to save it. In my lifetime, I've witnessed a terrible decline. In yours, you could and should witness a wonderful recovery. That desperate hope, ladies and gentlemen, delegates, excellency, is why the world is looking to you and why you are here.
Personally, I've been totally aware of the political disputes about climate change. The Conservatives arguing that climate change isn't as big a deal as the Liberals are making it out to be. And the Liberals sounding the alarm that change has to happen and happen now, or there will be dire effects, some of which we're seeing already. But what has surprised me is the disputes among all the people coming to Glasgow, arguing and infighting about how best to attack this global problem. What I want to know, can we, the world, come together here in Glasgow to reach a consensus in action and take that action to the four corners of the world and affect change? Let's find out. COP26, the 26th coming together of the nations to discuss, negotiate and plan strategies to protect the Earth's climate. What's significant about this United Nations meeting? We have to go back to the beginning. In the 1970s, environmental scientists started raising questions about the rise in carbon emissions and how that was creating greenhouse gases. The world came together in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit to talk about it.
So what went right in that 1992 moment was that the world community came together and said, we have an issue with climate change.
That's Dan Esty, law professor at Yale University in the United States. He was there at the beginning and was on the US negotiating team.
Unfortunately, in terms of what went wrong, people did not follow through. And that really sets up the stage for our conversation in Glasgow, where one of the things that's most notable is that people are now clear that talk is not enough. To quote Greta, who's in the streets, no more blah, blah, blah. You know, we've got to change from just talking about things to actual follow through.
Jerome Ringo started his career in Louisiana in the petrochemical industry. He saw the effects of pollution and heavy emissions firsthand and became a vocal proponent for the environment. He was there as a speaker at Kyoto, Japan for COP3, which resulted in the first global treaty for climate action. I asked him what went right and what went wrong.
A lot of things went right because it was the beginning of where we are today. What went wrong? The U.S. took forever to ratify Kyoto. And it was embarrassing.
What was the reason for such delay from the US?
It was politicized. You had one side of the aisle saying, let's do it, the other side saying no. To sign Kyoto, we were going to have to put in place regulations that would basically regulate industry and would really put pressure on the auto industry, the petrochemical industries, and mandate them to take the necessary steps that would reduce CO2s to the atmosphere.
A reason I've heard that the US never ratified Kyoto was because they felt that they were being unfairly targeted and that other industrialized nations didn't have to follow the same rules?
Yes. China, of course, wanted to always maintain the status of a developing nation. I mean, come on, when you're bringing on one coal-fired power plant every week, you're not a developing nation.
Right. You're
totally industrialized. And the U.S. wanted China to play by the same rules that were required by the U.S. So that was a legitimate argument. What we've learned to date is that it's going to involve the totality of the world, a total participation of the world at every level. There are going to have to be requirements of everyone in every corner of the earth to take real action to help reduce CO2.
I suppose to put on your professor hat for a minute, how would you grade the different COPs throughout the years?
So I think we've got a couple that stand out, and then a lot that were quite mediocre, sort of C on a scale of A, B, C, D, F.
Okay.
And at least one F. But the next place where you might really think the world was making a difference and moving towards success in a big way was Paris in 2015, at COP21. But frankly, just before that, there had been a big push around a theme of seal the deal, and that was in 2009 in Copenhagen. But that turned out to be, I would say, a D or maybe an F on the scale of A to F, because things didn't come together. The parties didn't agree. China was foot-dragging. India was also foot-dragging. The US was disorganized. And there wasn't a framework to really mobilize action. But I think Paris brought people together and frankly changed one very important thing, changing a mistake that had been made in the original agreement and repeated in the Kyoto Protocol. And that was to allow the world to be divided into two groups. A so-called Annex 1 set of countries that agreed to take real action, and a non-Annex 1 list of countries who were effectively invited to sit on the sidelines.
Which brings us to COP26. It's a time of reckoning for the Paris agreements made in 2015. You see, simply put, the Paris Agreement has the goal to limit the temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius, or even better, 1.5, by 2050, compared to pre-industrial levels, while at the same time reaching a carbon output of net zero. Each country that signed into the treaty was to put forward their own goal and plan to reach that goal, called an NDC, or Nationally Determined Contribution. And by the Paris Agreement, every country is to revisit their goals and make them more ambitious. Well, Glasgow is the 5th year. And how have the countries of the treaty done so far?
We're having hurricanes and typhoons and droughts. The Arctic is melting. California is on fire. Unbelievable. These are now problems. We can't wait until tomorrow. We don't have the luxury of time. We must act now.
Is China a no-show? Is India really committed? Let's find out when we return on the road to Glasgow. With all the participation at the Council of the Parties in Glasgow, there have been a couple of notable absences. World leaders not in attendance are Vladimir Putin of Russia and Xi Jinping of China. The UK's Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, wasn't overly concerned about this.
Yes, it's true that President Xi isn't here, but on the other hand, the Chinese team is very high level. You know, he didn't want. I talked to him. He didn't want to come because of the pandemic, and you've got to respect that. The same was the case for Vladimir Putin. But that doesn't mean the Chinese are not engaging.
But the United States President Joe Biden and former President Barack Obama had a different opinion.
But the fact that China, trying to assert, understandably, a new role in the world as a world leader, not showing up, come on. The single most important thing that's gotten the attention of the world is climate. Everywhere. From Iceland to Australia, it just is a gigantic issue. And they've walked away. How do you do that and claim to be able to have any leadership mantle? Same with Putin and Russia.
I have to confess, it was particularly discouraging to see the leaders of two of the world's largest emitters, China and Russia, decline to even attend the proceedings. And their national plans so far reflect what appears to be a dangerous lack of urgency, a willingness to maintain the status quo on the part of those governments. And that's a shame.
All this is significant because the greatest carbon emitter in the world right now is China. And it's not by a small amount. In the lead to be the biggest emitter of carbon, a race you don't want to win, China has taken the first position, increasing their output by 400% since the Rio Earth Summit of 1992. Right now, China emits over 30% of the world's CO2. 30%. In distant second is the United States at 13.5%, then India, then Russia. But Can real climate action towards 1.5 degrees Celsius really happen without the biggest emitter? One of the early announcements to come out of COP26 was India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, announcing his country's net zero target, 2070. While many leaders lauded India's commitment, many here at the conference were shocked and saddened by committing so far down the road.
Prime Minister Modi comes with a commitment for net zero emissions for India in 2070. So on the one hand, we should celebrate the fact that India has joined the parade, albeit at the back.
Sure.
But what we really need now is for India to step up its game as well.
As I walk around the grounds here at COP, there's a lot of talk about finance and the economics of climate action. This seems to be a hot button topic for the negotiators.
We're going to need to see local governments making climate finance, climate adaptation, one of the main things they do.
That's David Jackson, Director of Local Finance for the UNCDF.
When you look at the mandates for what needs to be done to adapt to climate, it's always been a local thing. Edinburgh looks different from Timbuktu, which looks different from somewhere on the Arctic Circle, because each city is built according to its climate. There's going to have to be another round of that, like 2.0. So local governments around the world are going to have to reinvest in infrastructure, to refurbish existing infrastructure. Likewise, the clothing industry, is going to have to reinvest in new non-fossil fuel clothes. Probably most of the people in this room, they're wearing some form of polyester. Polyester is a fossil fuel, comes from fossil fuels. We're going to have to find new ways of clothing ourselves. So it's a seismic change, and the models are there now. It's just about getting the finance to follow those models.
It's called climate finance. And climate finance, this is the government money. Climate finance needs to do specific things that help what's called mitigation or preventing more carbon getting in the atmosphere, or adaptation, which means responding to what's already happening to the climate.
Right. That's Harvey Locke, a recognized conservationist who has been championing Earth's nature for decades.
If we think of the sort of idea of follow the money, show me the money, that kind of thing. So what are we seeing in that space, for example, in integration? So we have the UK, which has dedicated 1/3 of its climate finance, 30% actually, or £3 billion, I think it is, to the idea of doing climate with biodiversity outcomes.
Okay.
France has devoted fully 30% of its funding, which is very high as well, to the same thing. And then on 2 days ago, Canada said 20% of our funding, which has been doubled recently for the climate, will be devoted to this interface between climate, meeting climate goals, but connected to biodiversity. And that's $1 billion Canadian, which is real money.
What about the 100 billion that was promised?
So I think we know that there's a lot of money needed to relay the energy foundation of modern society. And the $100 billion that was committed back now some years ago was actually a commitment to mobilize capital. And that's important, because it didn't mean that governments were going to give, the industrialized country governments were going to give money to the developing world. But it did mean that they were going to give some money and mobilize capital through private banks and private financing sources. And there has been a calculation of how far we've gone. The best numbers suggest that we're quite short of the 100 billion. Maybe it's 50 billion. Some are saying 80 billion. Some are saying it's actually 30. But I think we know that whatever that sort of calculation is against the 100 billion that was to be mobilized, we're still short. And frankly, I would argue that 100 billion is not enough to fully fund this transition. That's 100 billion per year, by the way. We're going to need more. And I think that also has started to come into focus here in Glasgow. And people are saying, we got to get all that money going, public sources of finance, the multilateral development banks, private capital from banks and from individuals. And all of that is, again, part of what this point of leverage that I think is making change really come together here. Now, will it be delivered in the end? It's not sure. We still have to see over the coming weeks and months, but there's some signals that are quite promising.
We go from following the money to following the science when Road to Glasgow continues.
And because of the pandemic, as you know, we postponed COP26 by a year. But during that year, climate change did not take time off. And the IPCC report in August was a wake-up call for all of us. It made clear that the lights are flashing red on the climate dashboard. That report, agreed by 195 governments, makes clear that human activity is unequivocally the cause of global warming.
There are a lot of differing opinions on the state of the Earth's climate. Back in the late 80s, the United Nations set up a large group of scientists to study the issues and come to a consensus. And this is the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The reports by the IPCC play a key role in shaping policy and plans at the COPs.
So scientists have known that the climate's changing for quite a long time, starting back in the 1950s when David Keeling started measuring carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And it was in the 60s and even the 70s that people started letting the US government know that we're seeing changes due to the fossil fuel burning, due to land use change. And the United Nations took hold of this and decided to set up the IPCC, recognizing that this is a challenge that the world needs to work on and try and solve together.
I hear the rallying cries, science, not silence, and listen to the science. But is it that simple? Just trust the science? Can anyone pick and choose the data that supports their position while throwing away or ignoring other data? I asked Professor Jamie Toney at the University of Glasgow to get her thoughts.
People can cherry pick data and try and use the data to tell the story that they want. You have to be really careful when you're looking at data. That's one of the reasons why the IPCC reports are so important, because you have hundreds of scientists coming together to actually review the information and the data that's in those reports and make sure that the data is not cherry picked and it is telling the correct story.
Success is possible because we have the science. The data is unequivocal. Climate change is widespread, rapid, intensifying, and already impacting every region on Earth, on land, and in the ocean. But one number stands out above all others. We must limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century.
The goals have been set, no more temperature rise than 1.5 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial levels. But how do we achieve that? What is the plan? And do we have the technology needed to achieve that plan? I really want to know where the rubber meets the road.
More and more countries are starting to build kind of long-distance grid lines, DC grid lines, to connect across large geographies. If you build the right kind of grid infrastructure, you don't lose much power when you push the electricity across large distances. And so that is one of the, again, the solution is there. The challenge there is building it, and countries are starting to build it, and then some geopolitical tensions as well. Connecting all of that solar power potential in North Africa to Europe, which has a large power need, is needed, but there's some challenges there that governments are and needing to work through.
In terms of the consumption and in terms of the way we live, I think we have to align with that 1.5 degree future and ensuring that we adapt in terms of what kind of buildings we build, what materials we use. Now there's the hard way in saying all of these things we can't do anymore, or we can find new technologies, we can find less intense ways of living, ways of consuming, etc. So it has to do with behavior change, it has to do with the mindset, but it also has to do with how much every step along the way actually consumes.
With all the calls and protests to end fossil fuels and totally eliminate carbon-based energy, I wonder if we even have the capability to do that right now. I searched for some experts on energy to shed light on whether we have the technology.
Short answer is yes. We produced a roadmap back in May, which was called the Net Zero Emissions Scenario, where we showed how with a range of different technologies, the whole world could actually phase out use of carbon-intensive resources and generate net zero. So yes, it is possible.
We are ready, and we are getting readier as we develop the technologies on the way.
Outi Ervasti is the Vice President of Renewable Hydrogen at Neste in Finland. They have a technology that could very well be an answer.
What I'm responsible for is this renewable hydrogen. Hydrogen is a chemical that is used in many industrial processes. Hydrogen can also be an energy carrier or an energy storage. Traditionally, you make hydrogen out of natural gas, and in that process, there is a lot of CO2 that is getting released. With the new technologies, we can make hydrogen by splitting the water with renewable electricity. And then we can get oxygen and hydrogen. And in that process, there is no emissions. So through introducing this green hydrogen into our industrial processes, into our energy system, we can cut emissions significantly.
The developing world is struggling. On the one hand, they're trying to provide basic electricity supply. They're trying to roll out electricity to parts of the countries which don't even have it yet. In Africa and Asia, there are still millions of people who don't have electricity. And they're trying to do it as cheaply as possible, which often means just using fossil fuels.
Tom Howes works with developing countries to implement energy best practices.
So these are all struggle points for developing economies. Through introducing measures like energy efficiency, trying to switch to local renewable sources when they can. So in Africa, for instance, making use of the sunlight that they've got to use to generate solar power. In Asia and in Africa, there's hydro resources which we can harvest to get hydroelectricity. So developed countries finance us to work with these developing countries to look at the policies they're introducing, help them work out how they can actually reform their energy sector and make it more efficient and less fossil fuel dependent.
When I first started this road to Glasgow, I learned about how the issues of nature and climate have been kept separate, but are now being brought together as a holistic approach to the environmental crisis.
What we're beginning to have clarity on, and I say we meaning a community of people, the climate community, the nature community, is that you can't solve the climate problem without looking after nature, and you can't protect or look after nature without stopping the climate from running away on us.
I think we've been focusing for 25 COPs mainly on climate, and I think in the last year we've really come to the point of understanding, and that knowledge was around for a while, but I want to say there was now broad awareness that we will not win on climate if we don't keep nature intact.
Patrick Frick, who works for the Global Commons Alliance. I asked Patrick to tell me more about the Global Commons.
Without those global commons intact, losing the rainforest, losing the Arctic ice sheet by seeing it melting in a way, and the other global commons, there's just no way we can keep large parts of this planet habitable. So I hope we walk away with realizing that it's time to come together as one people, take care of this beautiful planet and its commons, and take the actions together to make that happen.
I will say that this COP has been unprecedented for the nature agenda.
That's Shyla Raghav, the Vice President of Climate Change for Conservation International.
In the past, we really were just struggling to get nature even mentioned and even get nature recognized as part of the climate conversation. But here, actually, last week, we saw a whole day dedicated to very high-level announcements and commitments on nature. We saw more than $1 billion committed to Indigenous people and local communities to support them in stewarding their land. We saw a massive financial commitment to redirect and shift financial flows from what is destroying and destructing nature to regenerative practices, and $8.67 trillion in assets that was announced, and billions of dollars of aid from national government. So I came away from last week very encouraged and inspired by this recognition of the more systemic nature of addressing the climate crisis through sectoral approaches that include nature.
But the really exciting frontier is this intersection between carbon neutral and nature positive. And that's what we need, is we need this idea of nature positive to dock easily with this idea of being carbon neutral or net zero that you hear everywhere. And you'll see it on pavilions, and you'll see it in the people's speeches everywhere, nature positive, carbon neutral. Well, that's this coming together. And it's just really fun to see it's actually happening.
I'm so glad you're so positive. In a conference full of angst and worry, Harvey's excitement and optimism was contagious. The father of capitalism, Adam Smith, wrote his Wealth of Nations right here at the University of Glasgow. Can capitalism and environmentalism move in the same direction? We'll find out when we return to the road to Glasgow. Glasgow, Scotland, centre of the Scottish Enlightenment, leading to the Industrial Revolution. Is that what got the world to the brink of destruction? Or will Glasgow be known as the place the world came together with a workable climate plan? Can industry and government have a common goal and a consistent mission? In the 18th century, this was the location for the Scottish Enlightenment. At a time that England had 2 universities, Scotland had 5. It was from this period that the Industrial Revolution was incubated. Adam Smith, known as the father of capitalism, was a professor at the University of Glasgow. While many point to his manifesto, Wealth of Nations, he preceded that magnum opus with a book on morality. I think this is a crucial distinction as the world gathers back here, the birthplace of economics, to develop plans to reduce carbon emissions to pre-industrial levels. To have capitalism without morals is simply selfish greed. It can't be profit above all, but I believe must include an outward focus. And that's why industry must lead the way to a greener, more sustainable future.
Now, I'd say another big conclusion coming out of this whole discussion over the course of several weeks is how quickly that governmental commitment to net zero greenhouse gas emissions has cascaded to the business community. And this is a very important point, because the real decisions that affect the carbon footprint of a society are not just made by presidents and prime ministers. They're made, frankly, by mayors and governors and subnational leaders, but also by corporate leaders. So the fact that you've got all of that group gathered really offers, I think, some promise that this is the moment the world is shifting towards real action.
We believe that a sustainable business is a good business, especially in the long term. So as an example, Zurich has been asking for a price on carbon because it would just enable us to have a more level playing field. For us, it is clear that the private sector or businesses in general has to have a role to play in this. And it is a good business case in the long run.
我们是来自台湾。那当初创办 EarthX 这家公司的时候呢，是因为我的父母过世了。那我的父母呢，是因为癌症，还有就是因为他的器官受到一些化学物质的侵袭，所以让他的器官受损。所以我创办这家公司的时候，是希望说，我们可不可以重新去做一个公司，然后这个公司呢，能够对就是不只是一个化妆品的一个公司，它是能够对人类、对社会、对环境都是有很好贡献的一个品牌。那所以我们就创办了这家公司。
Over and over, I ran into captains of industry who aren't just paying lip service for better marketing, but who really want to make a difference. No one embodies this more than Stephen Coe from Outi.
后来呢，不只是你知道我们是做shampoo，就是做洗发精起家的，可是就是我们不只是一个化妆品公司，我们公司有将近280位的年轻人，我们都希望做一个对人类、对社会、对环境都是一个好的品牌，对。
How did you then get involved in climate issues?
Curiosity. I've been with the business 5 years. We're a government-led concession. We had some environmental indices that we needed to report on. And then we started to hear a lot of talk about sustainability, carbon neutral, zero carbon.
The first woman to lead a major transportation company, Diane Crowther, is a real inspiration, not only to women like me, but for industry looking to invest in a greener future.
So we got curious and started to sort of say, what's that mean for High Speed 1? So we commissioned a socio-economic impact study because we didn't really understand our green credentials. And we were quite blown away that we're actually a very, very green form of transportation and make a significant contribution to the communities that we served. But we also wanted to do more. So we started to sort of say, what are our targets going to be? So we've now set ourselves a target to be carbon neutral by 2030. And we're doing that with the whole of our value chain, our train operators, our suppliers, our retailers, but also our end customer as well. So it's a good place to be at the moment. It's quite exciting.
You're seeing a shift in clean technologies from being basically unprofitable about 10 years ago to just in the last decade becoming profitable and competitive.
That's Rod Richardson. As I see more and more people vilifying capitalism, Rod thinks capitalism holds some solutions to the climate problem.
If you look at the socialist, the guys that have gone full bore into socialism, like Cuba, Venezuela, you know, the Soviet Union in the past, all of those are massive economic failures. You know, China only avoided that by turning to capitalism. If you want to, you know, deploy, you know, new technologies at speed and scale, the only way to build an economy like that is using the principles that gave us the Industrial Revolution.
As we learned in Washington, D.C., the key to real and lasting climate action will be because government and industry come together. The biggest advances I've seen on this road to Glasgow have been when business and corporations lean in and embrace a greener future. Here in Glasgow, I caught up with real estate mogul and EarthX founder, Trammell. How important do you think the private sector and businesses are to climate action?
The very most important of all are the people.
Oh, okay.
The ordinary people doing their bit. But individual action, one by one, drop by drop, is the most difficult thing of all. It's hard for me or anybody to think, if I put this there, how much does that really matter? But on business, it's scale. So my Texas viewpoint, business is the leader. We have to take the initiative, or government will never do it without leadership from business.
Left versus right, liberal versus conservative. Can the climate problem be solved with only half the people? Let's find out what the other side is saying when we return to the road to Glasgow. On this road to Glasgow, we've heard from mostly people sounding the alarm about the climate. But as we look at the Earth from all sides, why don't the more politically conservative join in on the effort? Why do they oppose us helping save the planet? This is a big piece of the puzzle missing for me. I want to know more. I caught up with 2 Republican congressmen from the United States in Glasgow and got to ask them exactly that. Do you believe that there is a climate crisis?
Of course. Of course, yes. Utah right now is in the state's longest drought. Most of the summer we have beautiful mountains and the residents couldn't see the mountains because of the smoke coming from Oregon and California and the forest fires. Our ski season is supposed to start in a few weeks and every year we have less snow. So the word crisis is, you know, unique to everybody's definition, but certainly this is something that demands our attention and demands our best efforts.
From Utah, Congressman John Curtis at times sounded just like any of the other climate activists I've talked to on this road. Maybe they're not the enemy, not the bad guys. Is it possible we all want the same thing? What would you say to those who think that Republicans don't care about the environment?
Well, I understand from a branding perspective we've done a terrible job, but the reality of it is we care deeply, and I can show you strong evidence of that. And if you go back in time, you go to Roosevelt and national parks, you go to Richard Nixon and EPA, George W. Bush spoke about it frequently, and more recently Republicans joined Democrats in the Energy Act of 2020 and passed one of the most substantial pieces of climate legislation on a very bipartisan basis. And I'll tell you, in my state, you're not going to find anybody that doesn't care deeply about leaving this earth better than we found it and being good stewards over the earth.
As Republicans, we acknowledge it's man-made and there's a cost to it. And the question is, what is that cost? So if you listen to the general narrative at a place like COP26, the cost is enormous. There's no price too high that we could pay to mitigate that cost. Now, the next question is that true, and is that what the UN climate report says? Is that what the IPCC says? And the answer is emphatically no. And nobody's actually read it when they show up to this thing.
That is the firebrand, up-and-coming star of the Republican Party, Congressman Dan Crenshaw of Texas, a former Navy SEAL. He doesn't waste words.
And so what does the IPCC actually say? It lays out in pretty clear terms what the costs are. And it actually uses, in these cost estimates, the worst case warming scenario, which every scientist agrees is completely unrealistic. So this like 4 degrees Celsius warming scenario, which is only realistic if we do nothing, right? If we increase our coal use and oil use, which is not happening and has no potential to happen. So there's a cost It's just nothing what the alarmists say it is. And, you know, and they come back and they'll say something like, okay, but you're from Houston, or Houston's gonna be underwater, or Miami's gonna be underwater. And my question back to them is, one, that's probably not true. Again, you're using alarmist modeling to come up with that, but I think there will be sea level rise, and again, there's of course a cost associated with that. The question is, if we stopped emitting all carbon dioxide at this moment, would it change that? You know, and they don't want to answer that question, because now you have to have a more reasonable conversation about what kind of cost you're imposing on humanity and then asking what benefit you get from it. And they're pretending like you're getting this big benefit when in reality, if you're listening to the science and also common sense, that's just not the case.
And I think it's fair to say that both parties have extremists. On the left, you have these people who are gloom and doom, calamity, the Earth's going to blow up in a couple of years. That doesn't help either. On the right, of course, we have those who deny it, and I consider both of those extremists. The other thing I think is important to remember is the way the climate is talked about just turns off Republicans. And so instead of coming back and saying, well, let us tell you our answers, they tend to disengage. And I get that that's perceived as not caring, but it's just not true. I don't talk to Republicans that really don't care about this Earth.
The debate has moved on from this sort of, whether you're a climate denier versus a climate alarmist. It's moved on from that. Again, as you can tell, I still quibble with the details, only because the alarmism leads us down a dangerous path. So I do have to quibble with their notions that the world's ending in 12 years, or that the world is on fire, or that every storm we see is because of climate change. I do have to push back against those details, because that does matter when we talk about more rational solutions.
It appears that language may be creating a huge problem. Our specific choice of words can carry so much connotation and power and emotion that it creates such intense division. I think the answer lies in finding creative ways to speak about these things and communicate so that we are inclusive and not creating walls between each other.
It's not that we don't want to be good stewards, it just is that we feel this Green New Deal, this extremism, and that tends to turn off Republicans.
Yeah, there's too many negative connotations attached.
Just with the word, right.
Perhaps if we found better language.
Listen, we do. I mean, I'm from a very Republican district, perhaps one of the most Republican in the country, and if I stand up in a town hall meeting and I say, let's talk climate, the room divides in two, right? But if I stand up and say, who thinks we should leave this Earth better than we found it? Everybody's on board, right?
Certainly, the language of radicalism, extremism, and alarmism isn't productive because it's isolating and fear-inducing, which is counterproductive to collaborative action. We all have a common goal: to protect our children and our futures, and to preserve the beauty of our communities, countries, and the planet we all share. I think we actually all do have common goals in this crisis, but the problem is that our fear lies in different places. If only we could tap into that and understand each other on a deeper and more human level and have more empathy for the other side, then perhaps we could achieve true collaboration instead of division, hate, and mistrust. You know, for me it feels a wee bit like a Dickens novel. It's the best of times, it's the worst of times. Age of wisdom, the age of foolishness. COP President Locke and United Kingdom Prime Minister Boris Johnson were cautiously optimistic. But there were serious obstacles to the COP, from the world's biggest emitter not coming to goals being set that were far from the ambition that is direly needed. But some steps forward were taken, specifically in fighting deforestation and protecting nature, to reducing dangerous methane gases. The question I have, and I hear it often from others as I walk the grounds here at the conference, will the countries follow through on their own plans? For without follow through, this is all just empty, fruitless talk. And for my generation, and the ones that are to follow, we simply cannot settle for that. And finally, it's going to take most, if not all of us, to protect our planet. And I've found that maybe most of us want that sometimes language can divide. Hopefully we can break down the divisiveness and come together. We owe it to our children and to our planet. Our road to Glasgow has taken us all over the world, meeting people who are working towards making a difference. I know I've learned so much from them. But what now? The road to Glasgow is not at an end. The road continues up hills, around corners, through heavy traffic and through scenic vistas. Come with me as we travel on this road towards a greener, more sustainable tomorrow.